So welcome everybody to our webinar this evening on recruitment, building high-performing teams in academic surgery, opportunities and challenges of inclusive recruitment practices. We have a great panel for you tonight. We're gonna get a lot of different perspectives on this issue and talk about some of the best practices that we've used, and we're gonna talk honestly about some of the struggles that we've had and some of the, I think, productive conflict that's come out of this initiative. The format for the night is that Dr. Erica Newman, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to give an overview of these practices for about 15 minutes, and that'll be a PowerPoint didactic style talk. And then we're actually going to go through and get the perspective of a bunch of different people who have chaired, served on, interviewed at, etc., and have them share what they think worked and didn't work around these processes. And then we're going to have an open discussion. So for those of you who are joining us, think about questions as you hear the first parts of this and jot them down and then enter them in the chat. I'll be moderating and looking in the chat for questions. We have some themes that we're going to touch on no matter, that I want to work in, but we'll work them in the context of your questions that you put in the chat. So next I'll dive in and get started with the short didactic part. And I'll introduce Dr. Erica Newman. Many of you know her. Dr. Newman is a pediatric surgeon here at the University of Michigan. She specializes in pediatric malignancies and directs a clinical program serving patients with those diseases. She also runs a basic science laboratory and holds leadership positions here. She is a vice chair for faculty development, which she's held over several years. And is now our inaugural Associate Chief Clinical Officer for Health Equity in our medical group. And Erica is going to kick off here because she really pioneered the development of these practices and was the first chair of our department-wide recruitment committee. And she's going to start off with the why and the what of these practices. Dr. Newman?
Thank you. So yeah, let's just get right in, make sure I can advance my slide. So we put this slide up here, and first I just want to say thank you so much, all of my partners that have joined us in this webinar today. We'll hear from everyone, but when I look around and look at the people on the screen, this is the work of all of us from the very beginning to the end. So for example, this data that I'm putting here, Jennifer Wald pulled this back in 2015 and 2016 when we were strategizing on how we could make our department better. And, these next few slides we looked at this data and realized that, we could really be more diverse with respect to gender and with underrepresented minorities. And so we started there, but then we realized that the journey towards diversity is really much deeper than gender and race. But we did look at demographics, and so this slide is an example of what our department looked like from 2005 to 2015. And we realized that the numbers had not really changed in 10 years with respect to how many women were being hired into the department. Not only were there disparities in the number of women, but women were staying at the assistant professor level much longer than men. And in fact, that disparity was getting worse with time. The other thing we looked at was the numbers of underrepresented minority surgeons in our department. And again, these numbers were really low. Particularly, there were years in which we had no people of color. And so this is a 10-year period. And so why is this important? We began what I still call a journey that we're still on, trying to understand the benefits of diversity. We know that successful workplaces mirror the makeup in the community with respect to identity, and that these differences are really a component of excellence. They foster innovation, creativity, empathy, and that diversity really goes beyond gender, race, and ethnicity. And we're really striving for cognitive differences in cognitive ability, education, socioeconomic backgrounds, culture. And this is really beyond the optics. This book, I think, was one of the first books that we all read as a department. And just about everyone in our department read Scott Page's The Diversity Bonus. And in his book, he talks about when you're building teams, the benefit really of having differences in ability, differences in talent, differences in viewpoints, that really makes your team stronger and higher performing. And so we really have bought into this. We believe this. This is really a core component of our vision around why we think that diversity is so important. The other thing that we hope to do is that we're preparing our department for the next generation of surgeons. And so this is an example. The millennials are really quite different, I think, than traditional, surgeons that were coming through 20, 30 years ago. The data shows that by 2025, 75% of the global workforce will be this millennial generation. And so they have varying experiences and backgrounds. They thrive on a culture of inclusion. They are looking for organizations that value diversity and inclusion. And so, we're really aiming to prepare our department for the next generation of surgeons. And so how do you do that? These numbers we don't think are intentional. We think that people, we've had good intentions and that this was not a purposeful trend, but we know that good intentions are not enough. So we've been on this, again, this journey of moving our department towards a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive place. And we've been doing that by, these 4 areas we've really held strong to: consciousness raising, educating ourselves, our learners, and people in our environment, empowerment and governance, and then figuring out ways to sustain change. So the Michigan Promise is our portfolio of programs that really have anchored our efforts in faculty development with this really keen focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so tonight we're talking about recruitment. I put this slide here, and I think the next slide and just to say that, recruitment does not stand alone in a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, and that this is really a comprehensive approach, this longitudinal commitment to making us better. This is a starting point for us. We are nowhere near the finish line. And again, recruitment, we think, is really a core component of a comprehensive approach to faculty development with a really keen eye on culture, environment, and preparing each surgeon to achieve excellence. And so this is our mission. We are hoping to develop a diverse, inclusive culture in which all individuals will advance and thrive. We hope to recruit the best and the brightest, create innovative strategies for ongoing professional growth and scientific discovery, develop the most talented and progressive leaders in academic medicine, and expand outreach to local, regional, national, and global partners. And so how do we do that for recruitment? We have developed what we think are best practices over the last 3 years. Leslie Dossett is our current chair of the recruitment committee. And so we have committed to maintaining a standing committee of faculty members that have really committed to deeply engaging in the recruitment process. We're committed to learning about fair and open recruitment. We are really focused on decreasing the influences of implicit bias during the search and recruitment process. We're really focused on removing subjective evaluations and subjective discussions from the recruitment process and really trying to focus on objective evaluations and criteria. We do this by utilizing behavior-based and attribute-based questions for each candidate, and we really standardized the process of campus visits where candidates sit with the committee and they engage in this really standard formal interview questions that are really focused on our values, and I'll share some of those in just a bit. And then we're focusing on building national partnerships. Surgeons traditionally are hired based on trusted networks and people we know. And so we're trying to broaden our reach and really leveling the playing field for applicants. That one, so this was the original 20 people committed to doing this that first year. And we all had implicit bias training. We committed to continue to really push ourselves to understand bias, understand our own biases, and also committed to some formal training. And so this is an example of 3 of the things that we all did. So strategies and tactics for recruiting to improve diversity and excellence. This was a University of Michigan workshop. The implicit association test. So this is a online module that is, anyone can take this, and you can go online and take bias tests for different identity areas. So you can do it for race, gender, disability, women in science. And so we've committed to doing that test. This test has had, criticized, people like it, people, hate it. But what it really does is it forces us to at least have the conversation about bias. It forces us to, continue to just try and learn more. The AAMC has a lot of resources. This is one, What You Don't Know, the Science of Unconscious Bias and What to Do About It in the Search and Recruitment Process. So again, this is just us. This is a very a baseline. These are the things that we've started with. The hope is that with time, we would continue to grow these resources. This is an example of when we had the STRIDE workshop. We actually did this as a grand rounds where we invited the moderators to come, and they gave this session for the entire Department of Surgery. We've broadened our reach to the sense of how we post new positions. And so we this is an example of a transplant search that was posted on the Society of Black Academic Surgeons website for the first time. We've also posted, and this is a requirement for all of our new job listings. So we post on the Society of Black Academic Surgeons, the Association of Women Surgeons, the National Hispanic Medical Association, and the diversity statement has been added. And so people typically don't, if you're looking for a new job, you probably won't go to the SBAS website to look at it. However, we do visit the SBAS website, and to see Michigan on there, I think really sends a strong message that this organization is aligned with our values, and we are interested in the members and looking at our job openings. And so these are other societies that we are trying to closely align with. In addition to just posting on their websites, we also attended their national meetings. And so multiple committee members, as well as Dr. Dimick, our chair, Dr. Mulholland, who was our previous chair, came along to these meetings, and we were all able to network and participate in the scholarly activities of the meetings. And so I think this is really a major component of our work around recruitment. This is an example of when Dr. Dimick and I were together at the SBAS meeting in Alabama, and one of the sessions was held at the First Baptist Church. And so this was a really powerful, meaningful moment for us to be there. And I think that the fact that Dr. Dimick was there with us was really impactful. Another aspect to the recruitment, one of our new recruitment procedures, is that we are really focused on diversifying our candidate pools. And so we are really focused on making sure that our candidate pools have diversity in gender, race, ethnicity, disability. And to that end, we've mirrored what the NFL is currently doing with the Rooney Rule, where at minimum, we have to have at least one qualified woman or underrepresented minority candidates who come to the campus for interviews. The hope is to have more than that. The data shows that at least having two underrepresented candidates gives them the best chance at success. This is an example of us doing a group interview. We interview in this really cool round room, and the candidates come and they get their, we go through the standard behavior-based questions. This is an example of some of the questions that are asked. They go through clinical, education, research, and then at the end, we make a recommendation. And this is an example of the letter, we send. Dr. Alam was the section head, Dr. Mahalan was the chair. Thank you for allowing us to participate in the recruitment. And we go and we rank the candidates. Dr. Dawson and I published the results of the first year of us doing this, and we were really proud of our results so far. We were able to diversify the number of women and underrepresented minority candidates that we're interviewing, as well as hiring. And we can share this paper and data if anyone is interested. So again, I'll stop now because I really want to leave time for discussion, but that really is the backbone of our recruitment process, the nuts and bolts of it. We do have a toolkit, and so if you're interested in that, please reach out and we'll make sure you get a copy.
Great, thank you for that overview, Erica. We didn't want to give you guys just didactics, but I think it is important just to kind of hear the intentionality and the processes and the best practices that were put in place around this, to at least hear them once. So then when we start a more open discussion, you can kind of hang your hat on what was done. And I think that to me, I'll just say briefly, since I'm listed first on my agenda for the department chair perspective, to me, I think the really absolutely most important thing about this is that it breaks the patterns of how we normally hire people. And that is people hiring their buddies. And this kind of like the sense that we all have a greater appreciation that people like them. And that is an absolute, the recipe for not being a diverse organization. And especially in a field like surgery, where most of the diversity is in the new hires, frankly, and not the full professors and the division chiefs. There's much less diversity at the top than there's at the bottom, because people, who are entering the field 20, 30 years ago, mostly look the same, just speaking frankly. And so I think that was disrupting those patterns is really important. And then starting to discuss these prevalent patterns and to open our eyes to a lot of the implicit and explicit biases that incorporate the recruitment process. Right? And so I think for me, as from a department chair, that's the most important thing, is just to have a space and a place to discuss and disrupt those patterns. And now I'm going to go through some other perspectives. And we have, like I said, we're just going to hear from everybody a little bit. And as you guys are thinking about that as participants in the webinar, please just start to write in questions there, and then we'll revisit those in the next part. So we're going to get perspectives from recruitment committee members, recruitment committee chair, also from one of our section heads or chiefs, who is now a chair somewhere else, is going to share his perspective. And then we'll get perspective from someone who interviewed in the process and hear what it was like to come through this process. So let's start with Dr. Alam, who most of you know became the chair of surgery at Northwestern just a little while ago, but was for the last 8 years the section chief of general surgery, which is the largest section here at the University of Michigan. And I can imagine, when the department decides to implement something like this, you could imagine conflict between a division chief who wants to have complete autonomy in hiring and deciding who to hire, versus now someone else has an opinion and they may give you a list that looks different than your list. So Hassan, why don't you just take a couple minutes and tell us about your perspective?
So just to set the stage, I was at Michigan for 8 years until 10 days ago. And my role was oversight of 7 different divisions. And they were very diverse divisions, very different clinical practice. And I recruited anywhere from about 3 to 7 people per year, a total of about 32 surgeons in 8 years. And just to give you an idea, about maybe 2/3 of them were recruited before this process was implemented, and about 1/3, a little over 1/3 after this process was implemented. So I've transitioned through this thing. And I'll give you my perspective, and then the upsides of the process and some of the challenges, because every new thing, no matter how sincere the effort is, there's some challenges. So personally, I look at recruitment as sort of the number one thing that you do as a leader of a clinical group or an academic group. My commitment was to get the top talent. Absolutely no compromise on that. And I think that the 30 or 32 individuals that are recruited, I would recruit them all over again. I think they are the top people in their fields. Now, how you decide who's the best, there is some subjectivity to it. And as Dr. Dimick just mentioned, the tendency is to gravitate towards people who look like you, who think like you. And I think that's where one of the advantage comes in, is that you get multiple very diverse opinion from 15 or 20 committed people who really don't have a dog in the race, except that they want to work with the best. So I think that's clearly an upside, where you get 15 people's opinion that if you had to pay for it, it would be a very expensive opinion, and they're all there in the room because they're committed to providing good input. It also creates transparency and trust in the process. So when you do bring a faculty in, everyone knows that that's the best person, not just because you say so, but because 15 or 20 really smart people say so. And it creates an acceptance, like the day the faculty shows up for work, they're not a stranger. They have gone through a process where a lot of people have seen them, they've talked to them, they've reviewed the CV, they know that that's the best person. So they automatically accept it as a part of the department based on talent and transparency and standard practice. Now, there are some challenges. And I said, like, I've watched the transition. And one of the challenges that every time you create a process that has a bottleneck, it is slower. And there is a bottleneck because recruitment is not spread over 12 months a year. It is a fall time. People finish their fellowships and they're looking for work. And the committee, with a quorum of 15 or 20 people, trying to get them scheduled and get them in a room, it's a challenging thing. And you're in a rush to get the top talent, and the top talent is in demand and everyone wants them. And you are trying to push them through a process that is very well-meaning but slower. But what I learned through this whole process is that it requires advanced planning. So you start thinking about who you're going to recruit and creating an agenda and a recruitment schedule months in advance, locking in the dates, reaching out to the candidates, and making sure that you're not just sort of rushing through at the last minute. So it requires prep, and it requires thinking ahead. But I'm trying to now bring some of those practices in my new job at Northwestern, because I think I learned a whole lot from it. So I think that there's a lot of variability in hiring practices, division to division, between cardiac surgery and vascular, surgical oncology and GI surgery and trauma. And right now I'm again in a recruitment phase and recruiting a lot of people at Northwestern. And I'm trying to create some best practices and some transparencies and some accountabilities and some oversight. So looking back at it, I learned a whole lot from it. And I think as long as you know what the upsides are and what you're going to get and what the challenges are, and not go into with eyes closed, it is, you can minimize the challenges and maximize on the upside. So I'll be happy to answer any questions during the chat session.
Great, thank you, San. And I think I was a chair for one cycle of recruiting, and I think we sat down together with San and I and the division chief and the recommendations, and I think we made some excellent decisions and kind of just worked through it together. I thought it was a very productive process. So Leslie, why don't you give the perspective of a chair of the recruitment committee? You were the chair for this most recent year, and what do you think the pros and the cons are, or I should say lessons and struggles?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Hassan, for that perspective. It's good to hear that. So I've reflected some on what the year was like this past year as the chair of the recruitment committee, and we handled, I think, 4 or 5 recruitments. And first of all, just from a personal standpoint, I'll say it was a really great opportunity. We talk a lot about, for leadership development, we talk a lot in our department about when there aren't sort of formal roles, carving out or making roles. And I think to have a committee and have a chair of committee is an easy way to provide an additional leadership role in the department. And I certainly learned a lot from doing it. I think when you think about, it's a great opportunity to meet some of the best surgeons around the country, even the ones who don't end up joining our faculty. I've gotten to be really good friends with somebody who interviewed at Michigan and didn't end up coming here. And so it's a great way for the committee to just meet other surgeons and spend an hour with them and learn about them in terms of networking. I think you learn a ton about interviewing, how to put together a CV, cover letters. Anytime you're seeing a lot of those with high frequency, just a good way to learn. And I got to spend a lot of time with other members of our own department that I would not normally get to interact with because our committee is made up of faculty from across all sections. And so just getting to know some of the other surgeons in the department was a great opportunity. I think it's hard work. We put a lot of time into the interviews. Each of the interviews at the assistant professor level are 60 minutes, and for leadership, professor level and leadership positions, they're 90-minute interviews, and we're interviewing multiple candidates for each position, and so it is a lot of time, it can be challenging. Usually the problem is having several excellent candidates and trying to adjudicate how to make a recommendation. We put it on our committee every time, not to sort of, to make a formal recommendation, even if it was hard and even if there was conflict, to not just say, it's a tie, but to actually put forward a recommendation. And not everyone agreed every time. And so working through conflict was also challenging. And I think it's hard work, but it's also really important work. And I'll echo some of what Hassan said in terms of, it's important work because we're selecting our future partners and colleagues. And I think that by making it more of a collaborative recruitment, more of a collaborative process with a committee, makes the whole hiring partner or the process, it puts the responsibility on making sure those faculty members are successful. It spreads it out across a lot more members of the department. I know that, and as he said, by the time, as the chair of the recruitment committee, by the time our new faculty showed up for their new positions this September, we've already spent, time getting to know them. And I think there's a greater sort of commitment to welcoming them into the department and making sure they're successful. So those are some of the kind of key takeaways. And again, I'd be happy to answer any specific questions during the discussion.
Great. So next we'll hear from a few of the sort of founding committee members who helped pull together the processes, but stepped forth and kind of walked into the unknown here a little bit. So the first we'll hear from Dr. Sanade, who's one of our director of liver transplant at the University of Michigan.
Thanks, Justin. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I think, this was a really profound experience for me, participating in this initiative. For a few reasons. I think, the first, it was, to be completely honest, very personally reflective. I can tell you that I was certainly someone who benefited from the old way of how we recruited people, certainly. The way I, got a residency position, I'm confident, is because of who referred me to interview at the place where I did my residency. And I think one of the things that was most apparent as we started this process is how hard it was to fight the inertia of the way we usually do things. So, in fact, I distinctly remember when we had the first couple of recruitments, and I would run into, one of the senior faculty or one of the division chiefs, for example, in the hallway. There was like, this negotiation that would start to happen. Well, let me tell you about, a really good candidate that you guys are going to be interviewing. And I would kind of, turn my ears off. Or, I think there was also some suspicion that maybe this would just be a rubber stamp of, for the chair or whomever, just to kind of say that the recruitment committee, blessed their candidate. And I think it was none of that, fortunately. I think we got better at this as we went along. I think we learned, as Dr. Dossett said, kind of how to interview better, how to handle the questions, how to create a dialogue when somebody kind of left a floating answer out there, with what's the follow-up question, to really get to know this individual, on a personal level, to understand how they think, how they would respond to conflict or challenges. And I have to say that probably the most rewarding part for me personally was when we would complete the interviews for a set of candidates for a particular position. And we would then bring the whole group together to discuss the candidates and talk about, trying to come up with a recommendation, as Leslie said, trying to really force ourselves to think critically about who we thought was the best fit, who would make us better, who would bring something unique to the department. And that process, that discussion was a really rich kind of experiment with the values that we were trying to uphold as a department. You could see them being hashed out right there in real time. Do we value their kind of CV excellence? Do we value their personal perspective? Do we value their, something unique about their training or background, or perhaps they're bringing something to our department that we've never seen before? I think, and having those open discussions among 20 people who are all really passionate about this being, the best place to work, and that we could make it. That process was really rewarding and a positive part of this experience for me. And I think, Erica made the point. I think the proof is in, the results. And I think we are early in this journey and we've got a long way to go and there's lots more to learn, but I'm confident we hired people that we would have not either seen or previously hired in kind of the old way of doing things, which is really gratifying to see.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So the next will be another committee member, Dr. Walji. And Dr. Walji has a special role in also being a kind of founder of the Michigan Promise. Erica and Jen were really the two that stood up a lot of these initiatives. And so I consider them, like many of us consider them, the founders of this process. And Jen was running with the launch teams and the initiatives that are linked to making sure that people succeed once they come through the doors. And Erica was running this, but Jen, Dr. Walji did serve on the committee. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's perspectives on this and learning. I was really grateful to be part of this committee. I found that it was, as others have alluded to, just incredibly rewarding, obviously from an organizational perspective, as Dr. Newman was sharing, and then also certainly from the perspective of my own personal growth as a leader and thinking about how to build teams, both recruiting people from the outside and then working with individuals within an organization. Just a couple of other thoughts on being in that room. It just always struck me how, coming together with 20 faculty or so from different perspectives, we really got an opportunity within 60 to 90 minutes to understand the experiences and perspectives of an individual who is coming to visit our institution in a way that we probably otherwise wouldn't have with a brief 15-minute on-campus interview where you're often answering the same questions kind of again and again. It really gave us an opportunity to get to know that person on a deeper level, and I think for them to get to know us. And what I was also struck by is when we would have conversations both with the individual and then afterwards, how everybody sees things through slightly a different lens, whether that's the clinical practice that they're in or, whatever other experiences that they're bringing to the table. But what also shines through is the fact that we all have these shared values around excellence and the clinical care that we deliver, the educational opportunities that we try to afford our trainees, and then certainly the science that we try to advance. And so I think it, strengthened us as a faculty member. And then I really hope that it showcased to the people that came to visit our campus, what our values are and how important this is, because we would make this commitment to be there. So with that, I'm really excited to answer any questions and further share my perspectives on this committee, but I'm excited to hear from everyone else. And thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Walji. I'm actually gonna go a little bit out of order here because I want to finish up the committees, and then we're going to hear kind of a really interesting perspective of somebody we hired during this process. So Dr. Sheets, why don't you go next? Dr. Sheets is a little different because he is a resident who has served on the committee. As I mentioned, or as Erica mentioned in her talk, one of the attributes here was, one of the goals here was to create a committee that is diverse in many different ways. And so one of the aspects of diversity we wanted to capture was multiple different ranks, including the residents that might be working with the faculty. So Dr. Sheets, why don't you give us your perspective?
Thank you. Yes, I spoke to a couple of the residents who served on the committee, and I think there's sort of briefly, there are three areas where I think this was meaningful and important to us. I think one is that from the committee perspective, I think the residents have a unique perspective on teaching and mentoring styles, both clinically and academically, for the faculty that are interviewing. And I think we're uniquely sort of positioned to determine how intentional they are about becoming a teaching member of the faculty here. I think the other thing was that it provided a lot of transparency for the residents about how hiring happens and to get them involved in that process. And I think people derived a lot of value from being invested and feeling as though they had a role in like who the department was becoming. I think from the perspective of the applicants, I think that it showed two things. One is that the residents' perspectives matter. And I think the other was that we were held to the same professional standards that the faculty are. And I think both of those things are important. And then I think for the residents, some people have alluded to this, but it was really educational for us to see how we should be presenting ourselves and how we're learning how to craft our own narrative and our own position as we go out and look for jobs and look for fellowships. And so, and then specifically how we would add value to organizations and what we would do uniquely to sort of position ourselves to be partners and to be collaborative in whatever departments that we would join. And so happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Kyle. And I do see some questions flowing in, and what I'm going to do is kind of collect those, and we'll go through those in the next segment. But now we'll hear from a faculty member, Dr. Kwashki, who's a colorectal surgeon here at the University of Michigan. Has been here, I think, 2 years, so probably came through here when we were still trying to figure out exactly how we're going to do this process. So I think broadens this perspective, and I've heard Dr. Kwashki talk about this on other occasions, and I think has a unique perspective on what this committee means to an applicant.
Thanks, academic. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. I know there's a lot of things you could have chosen to spend your time doing. So I just want to express my thanks for choosing to be here, because I think this is important. It just shows your commitment to creating diverse teams, and that is something, especially in our environment today, I think is essential. So thank you. And it is 2 years. That's actually September 1st was end of 2 years, and I almost feel like I want to do cartwheels because I never thought I would get to this point, and especially have this opportunity to work in what I consider as the best surgery department in the country, and then also with amazing partners. My division is like the best, hands down. So just wanted to give them a shout out. I always love hearing this team and this group, all the people who've been involved in the recruitment process talk, because it shows me how fortunate I am that things were changed. Because if things weren't changed, I don't think there was any way I would have had the opportunity to be in this amazing place. I still remember my first contact was with my division head, Dr. Regenbogen, and he did like a Skype sort of like initial run through to give me some idea of what Michigan was about. And then I had the invitation to formally interview, and I have to say that one of the things that the committee hasn't, or folks haven't discussed yet, is how the invitation is very personalized. I was given the opportunity to identify folks I wanted to meet with, and they didn't necessarily have to be folks within the Department of Surgery or within the division. And I don't know if that was the intention of the group, but it made me take a deeper dive into Michigan. I think I've explored every single avenue on the website, and I discovered all the global health efforts that were in place. I chose to meet with Dr. Joe Collars, who leads the global reach efforts. I chose to meet with Dr. Raghavendran. I joke that if I had a bucket list of academic surgeons that I would one day want to meet, it would have Justin Dimmock on it. And so I threw Justin Dimmock on the list. And and everyone I requested to meet with, they made it happen. And I think that goes to what Dr. Alam was talking about the complexities, trying to arrange an interview date when it is so tailored and personalized for the person who is coming to visit. And some of the people I met during my interview trail have become my best mentors and supporters throughout this whole process. The other thing that was very, very unique for me was actually the recruitment group interview. And it's something I have discussed on other platforms before. The first day I interviewed, it was just with a couple of folks. Well, actually, it was a long interview day, but with a couple of folks here and there. And after the first day, I actually called up my husband and I told him that I didn't think we should come to Michigan. One of the reasons for that was because I didn't feel like I belonged. And the best way to describe this is it was in the middle of a snowstorm. Everything was closed, no one was around. And I'm trying to put it poetically, but the best way I can say it is like, I looked across and there wasn't anyone who was looking back at me, inviting me, and no one who looked like me. And I hope that given the events this year, more people can appreciate why that is important, especially when you're making a decision to move your whole family to a place to call it home, a place that you want to stay for an extended period of time. And I just couldn't see that. Even though I had met with awesome people, I didn't think we could call here home. The second day was my recruitment interview. And I remember walking in, and as soon as I walked into this King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table situation they had going on, I was like, okay, this is it. And it was just the diverse faces that, welcome everybody there. It was the first time during my interview trail that I felt like I belong, because I could see people who looked like me. And it must have been the most diverse room I have ever seen throughout my entire, how many decades of training. And the other thing which stood out for me was the fact that unlike other places I had interviewed at, the questions that were asked allowed me to reflect and to dig deeper and to reflect aspects of myself that some of the cookie cutter questions don't typically get at. If you look at my CV, if you look at all those traditional things, again, this is not a place I necessarily belong at. But then I think if you ask the right questions, you find that there's more to me and there's more that I can offer. And that committee, the process that they had, allowed me to showcase that. And I'm grateful for that. The other thing that I have to point out is that it was the first time someone interviewing me actually advocated for me in the room during the actual interview. An example to give would be around, I think there was a question around my research, my prior research experiences, and if I had ever gotten funding support. And I had made mention of the fact that I had entered the country as an international student. I was a permanent resident, now a US citizen, but during my training, I could never qualify for funding. And initially the reaction in the room was like, is that true? Is that right? You could hear people mumbling a little bit. And in that moment, I was like feeling such like an imposter, like, okay, this is not going to work out. And I distinctly remember Dr. Marina DiMagliano speaking up, sorry, I'm a little bit emotional here, but she spoke up and she said, she remembers, like she came through a similar process. She was like, the NIH doesn't give grants to people who are foreign medical grads, not even permanent residents, and you have to be a US citizen. And that was powerful. There's no way I can put into words how powerful that was. To be in a group, well, in this setting, surrounded by 12 to 20 people, and then you're interviewing for this job, which means a lot to you. And already I had started feeling like I wanted to be here, and then to have this thing that I thought was a barrier put up, and then someone to get up from the committee and say, let me speak on her behalf, and let me speak to other people in the terms that they can understand. I can tell you, I walked out of the room, and the first thing I did was call my husband. I said, okay, I changed my mind. We're going to Michigan, and we're going to make it happen. And we did it at a great sacrifice, but it has been the best decision, and I do not regret it at all. And it has meant so much to me, and I'm just being so grateful for this opportunity.
Great. That was a powerful perspective, and I think is such a unique opportunity to hear someone who's been through the process and Gifty's being humble. She was by one of the, if not the best candidate in the country, and we were lucky to get her. And I think from the perspective of a chair, this committee and the intentionality that we brought to the process was the only thing that kept us in the game to recruit Gifty. Then that's the way that our perspective on that. And we're consider ourselves to be the lucky ones in that. So I think now we have some time for a broader discussion, and you guys, attendees, have written in a bunch of questions. So I'm going to start to dole those out. We have a couple of polls that we're going to do, and we'll kick those off at I think 8:25. But here I think there's some questions direct. I don't know, not all are directed. They're all very good. So I'll see if any of our panelists want to tackle this first one in the Q&A from Pooja Neiman, one of our health services researchers fellows and a resident at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Says, are there data or general guidelines on how much implicit bias training is needed to make an impact? Some institutions have a one-time lectures, others have a whole program, and there's obviously a loaded question here, since there's a lot of data showing that implicit bias training itself isn't necessarily effective. So I don't know. Erica, do you want to start that one, and we'll see if anybody else wants to? Do you have any thoughts on that? How much is enough implicit bias training for the committee?
Yeah, I think, the way we look at this is that, for me, I can speak for myself, and I think that we've tried to at least maintain this culture among the committee, is that, this is a lifetime journey. And so we all have biases, and it's something that we are all, we work at it, and you have to keep working at it, almost daily. And so just being able to, I don't know that we are ever going to reach the point where, we're, this is, training, and it's, there's no, I think, goal for how much training. I think that we offer some things that we want our committee to do at minimum each year, but our hope is that, every day, and particularly during interview season, that we're focusing on lowering bias, lowering the influence of implicit bias in everything we do. And so being able to really internalize that, I think has really become a part of our culture. And so, I guess the short answer is that there's no, this is not a thing that we can, put, four walls around and say that, this is the limit to it. But I think we just have to keep working at it, each day.
Yeah, that's generally how I think about it too. This isn't like a checkbox, like now you've been trained. This is like creating forums to discuss it. And I have to say, since we've been doing a lot of training, a lot of grand rounds, a lot of town halls, reading book clubs, and just, you can see and feel the IQ, the sort of implicit bias recognition and IQ slowly go up in the department. At least that's my perspective.
Justin, I think, an analogy I've given before about this is that, so let's say you decide you want to get in shape, right? And so you join a gym or get a personal trainer, and you meet with them the first time, and they usually put you through some sort of fitness test, some sort of assessment. And if you do that and they say, yep, you're out of shape, and then you walk out of there and never come back to the gym, there's, the fitness test is useless. And I think implicit bias training to me is like that. All it does is kind of expose your biases, your holes in your thinking. It has to be followed up with, intentional action and a really a curriculum, a program. And I think, as I alluded to in my comments, I think that's why we got so much better at this as it went on. I think we all came into the room green. We did the initial training. I thought the stride exercise was good. I thought the implicit bias training was kind of a slap in the face. So all those exercises were useful, but the progress only became from the next steps, from standardizing the way we assess people, from using these behavioral based questions, to thinking about ways to do comprehensive assessments of individuals that remove some of the biases of where they're from or who wrote their letters or things like that. So it really is, implicit bias testing is like day one. The journey is all after that.
Yeah, it's an interesting follow-up here by Ankush saying, just basically says beyond how much is enough, and I think we come to the idea that there's never enough. But there's certain formats that are effective, and I have some thoughts on that. Hassan, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, for change to take place, you have to be receptive to changing. So, I mean, following the same analogy that Chris was talking about, so when the trainer tells you to do something, you say, and don't do anything. But the second is I think some of these things about biases and your perceptions and preconceived ideas that you carry, some people are resistant to even acknowledging it. So you can put them through multiple courses and check multiple boxes. Their perceptions, how they deal with the world around them doesn't change. I mean, we right now living through a very charged setting, and with elections coming up, and people have very strong ideas, and sometimes evidence doesn't convince him to see the different point of view. So my only comment is that you have to be open to changing. Just sitting through a course and checking a box is not going to create change.
Yeah. All right, we got another good question here from Marissa Rodriguez, who says, can you comment on the selection of the recruitment committee itself and what you considered in shaping the ideal committee? So Leslie, why don't you tackle that one as the current chair?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that one a lot. I think when former chair Dr. Mahal and Erica were putting the committee together, it was, it was basically, kind of hand selected with particular attention to diversity of the committee members. So, making sure that all the sections and divisions within the department were represented, making sure that we had diversity of, gender and race, as well as academic phenotypes. So we wanted to have some basic scientists on the committee, some health services researchers, some folks that were heavy into, education administration. I think those are all important. As we've moved on, we've further sort of developed in our process, and now we have, the committee position is a term limit, so it's a 3-year term, and we have, so every year we've recruited new members to the committee as folks have rotated off. We issue an open call. We do that for every leadership position in our department, again, for transparency. I think some of the key things, I personally don't think that division, we don't have any section heads on our department. I also think that sort of division chiefs and people that are, heavily invested in the recruitment are not the best members, because they usually come to the table with a preferred candidate. So most of our committee are assistant and associate professors within the department. I think it's great to have the resident representatives on the committee. They always bring a really valuable perspective. And then we've sort of set a minimum of 3 years on faculty to be on the committee. And to be honest, that's really just due to the time commitment and making sure that our junior faculty members are protected from a heavy administrative burden. But I think that, making sure that all ranks are represented and that the committee is diverse. That's important, because a lot of times we get asked questions that one person can't answer, but the committee can usually answer any question that a candidate has, because we do have such diverse representation on the committee. And so thinking about it from that perspective is important as well.
So there's a great question here from anonymous attendee who says, I would like to understand how leadership empowered the committee, as well as how chiefs were influenced from the leadership perspective. And so this is a great question. I think I've been chair for 15 months. I would say a year, except the last 3 months have been earned. And but I think, I think that it was made clear very early on that the decisions of the committee would be respected and valued. And I think without exception that we have followed the recommendations of the leadership, of the recruitment committee. I think they're often aligned. In some cases, they're aligned with the what the division chief wants. And I think we've had a few times when they were not. When I was chair, I think we just worked through those and discussed it, and ultimately went with the recruitment committee recommendation. So I think it has to be, the chair has the ultimate decision about who gets hired. So the chair has to empower the committee. And so I think that I saw that happen. I don't know, before I was chair, was there, does anyone want to give any examples of, I think there might've been a few conflicts that I wasn't part of that were resolved, but I think ultimately the recruitment committee decision was upheld.
I mean, I could comment on that because so the recruitment committee decision, the way it was created, were not binding, but they carried a lot of force because 15, 20 well-meaning people, after a lot of deliberation, had expressed an opinion, written, and given it to you. So if and they ranked the candidates. So if I had 4 choices, and rather than going for the top 1 or 2 choice, and I would go for number 4 or 5, I better have a hugely compelling reason. They must have missed something that 15 or 20 people didn't see. That never happened. Now, the decision was always between number 1 and 2, and we were very fortunate in general surgery that we had such a good, robust pool of candidate that the choice between 1 and 2 was not a big difference. So I think that's one strength of the process, really, is that when you have that many opinions, it's much more likely that you're looking at the true top choice, because it's difficult to fool 15 or 20 people, and they can't all be blinded. So I think that's a good question, but I think you have, despite the decision not being binding, the moral power of that is pretty substantial. I don't think I can remember even a single one where we just sort of reach beyond number 1 or 2 on the list. And we typically went for top choice, and sometimes, they were not available, or there were some spousal issues in terms of recruitment. But I don't remember going beyond that.
I mean, I have to say that if the recruitment committee wasn't empowered, I think it would have fallen apart, because it's just too much time and effort. And had there been, all that time and effort put in, and then, you found that your recommendations weren't followed.
Yeah. I think, Leslie, my point is that you don't have to create, and a lot of people on the panel listening to these things, like, do you have to go to my hospital bylaws and create a different charter or something? I don't think you need to do that. I think that the weight of the recommendation, if you design the committee right and you give it visibility, I think it's very difficult in this day and age just to say, no, I hear 15 or 20 of you and I override you. So I don't think the bar is not as high. It was done with good faith and good intention and some transparency, but we didn't change the departmental policies or change hospital bylaws or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that the department chair support is really important, because as we all know, when hiring faculty, it's ultimately up to the department chair about who gets the offer, right? And so I think that support is really important.
Justin, I was just going to add one thing, is that, it was really important to us at the beginning to have some assurity that the committee would be empowered and have an impact with the hiring decision. And so one of the ways that we, picked the original members was that the chair and the section heads all made recommendations for who was going to serve. And so they, in doing that, the idea was that, they would entrust this group to be responsible for making these recommendations. And so I think that was really a really strong component, and why the decisions were held is because that group of 20 people were, people that were invested in the process. They committed to studying and learning about bias. They committed to studying and learning about fair and open recruitment processes. And so by the time we were 6 months in, where we were making recommendations about hiring, we were the content experts essentially on, trying to hire and follow standard recruitment processes. And so that, I think, really added to the level of empowerment. And so I think, and like Leslie says, a lot of work for people to put in. I mean, we would spend, we had 7 sessions in the fall, full day sessions where we would sit there and interview and then have discussions. And so it was a lot of time commitment, and to be assured that we were going to be empowered, I think was really important.
Great, that was a really great discussion. I'm going to interrupt the discussion just for 1 second here. We're going to do a couple polls, and we'll give you the results kind of at the end to prompt a little more discussion. So we'll go with the first poll question now. Great, so that's the first question. So let me see if we have any other, we've had some questions asked that were kind of answered in the chat here, but I think one of them is from the radiology department, for example. I assume that means at Michigan Medicine. Welcome. We want to move into this using this type of approach. What do you recommend is the very first step? Let's hear from somebody. Dr. Wald, why don't you tackle that, since you were there at the beginning?
Forgot to unmute myself. So in terms of setting up kind of the beginnings of these, I think as others have touched on, I think having leadership support, I think having transparency is critical. And I think that kind of fosters trust in the process. I think identifying individuals who are really committed to the mission and reflecting back, perhaps similarly around the same time we came together as a faculty and we're defining the mission of our department and what our vision was over the next 10 years. And so making sure that, that is transparent and that the individuals who are on the committee are committed to furthering that mission and vision, I think is really important.
Anything, Erica or Leslie, to add on like what your first steps would be in getting started with this? This may be a good point to plug the resources that we're going to make available. Leslie, if you want to do that.
Yeah, we're going to have our sort of completed toolkit put together. But I think, in my opinion, the sort of critical components to get started early is to make a commitment that every faculty position is going to be an open posting. Number one. Number two, that you're going to have some form of a committee, and I think there's variation in where along the process that committee might be involved. But to have a committee that just reduces bias, we've talked about implicit bias, but there's also, confirmation bias on, regarding a preferred candidate, and so having more than 1 or 2 people involved in the hiring process. Huge fan of group interviews. It gives you longer time with the candidate, so you get to know them better, and then using some standard behavior-based questions. Those are things that can be implemented fairly quickly, particularly standard questions and open postings. And so those are, I think, the things that you start out with, and then as we've moved along, we've gotten more sophisticated and revised our questions and our evaluation components, and committed to more training. But those are sort of the first steps.
Justin, there's one question about the recruitment committee and the section chief. I think I just wanted to clarify that, from everyone that was recruited at Michigan, they had multiple interviews. Okay, so the committee interview, they met with the committee for 1 hour, but their first visit was typically a 2-day visit. And then they came back, the selected candidates, the top 2 choices came back for a second visit, and they brought their spouses, and they met with the research mentor and all the other divisional people. So we made the committee interview as the upfront entry kind of a thing. So on the first visit, they all met with the committee, but that was not the only thing. So they went through days and days of meeting with other people and mentors and everyone else.
Yeah, so think of the recruitment committee as an additional interview, an additional panel interview, right? Like all the other interviews are still there because they'll need to meet with collaborators and their division chiefs and partners and maybe research collaborators. All those still is just an additional one.
Even more than the additional, I think as an initial screening and evaluation tool. So it's not like, on the back end of it that when you've already kind of, so I think it was a very intentional thing that the recruitment committee would meet with the candidate on the first visit, on the initial visit. So not sort of on the back end of it when you've already excluded some candidates.
Great, and here's a question here from our transplant fellow, our senior transplant fellow now, Meredith Barrett, who says, as someone who's about to embark on my own job seeking journey, I'm interested in how the committee worked to assess potentially non-traditional attributes of a candidate. How do you recommend highlighting those attributes when interviewing at institutions that may not have such a progressive recruitment initiative? Chris, you want to handle that? Or no, you could defer.
I don't know. Meredith probably doesn't want to hear my opinion since she hears it all the time. But no, I think, I'll defer to other members, but I will just say quickly that I would echo completely what Leslie said about the power of the group interview and kind of having a standardized approach to these questions, because you do draw out those things. A one-on-one interview, you might not get to kind of some of these layers, but to have the ability to sit there and watch the dialogue with other individuals in the group, to see that interchange, to ask questions about, that you ask the same question to multiple candidates that allow you a different perspective. So I think we were strategic in how we designed the questions to bring that up, but I think it's a great question. And I would defer to others about how to highlight that in your own.
I mean, as somebody who saw Meredith from an intern to like finishing her training, I think you don't have to worry about it. You have to be just yourself, and all your non-traditional but excellent attributes will come right through. But I think generally, for anyone else on the listening to this webinar, the idea is not to go in and either impress the committee by something that you make up or whatever. I mean, the idea is to find the right job for yourself and for them to find the right candidate. So I think as authentic as you are and as honest as you are, it's going to help you and help them because you're looking for a long-term relationship. The issue is, how can you be honest and authentic in a made-up environment that may be stressful and the questions that may be very directed? So I think that's the challenge. And I think so some of it is like, if you feel that you have some non-traditional but valuable attributes, then it may be up to you to sort of bring this thing up either during the panel interview or outside the room, or as sort of like when you make the initial call and you're setting up the interviews in terms of like, what you would like to highlight in your resume, or maybe things that are not even on your CV. So it's not gaming the system, it's like finding the right match.
Let's see, Gifty, do you have any thoughts on that? You're one of the only ones who's actually been through this process.
Yeah, Meredith, I think that's an excellent question. I'm reflecting at some of the other places I interviewed at and how it felt just like my residency and my fellowship interviews, very, very structured and very hard to do anything else. One place I interviewed at, well, a couple of places I did so after my Michigan interview. And what I did was contact them and ask if I could select people to meet with or to have them interview me, because that was something that had really impressed me with the setup here at Michigan. So that allowed me to meet with, in some places, the only underrepresented minority in the entire department or hospital, or identify a female or someone who might have a research interest. And I would, once they approved, I would send that person like a brief summary of why I had picked or selected to interview or meet up with them, because I wanted to highlight that aspect, that thing I was interested in, just in case we didn't have enough time to delve into it during that session. But it was very hard. I mean, when people, especially programs that are not as progressive, it's definitely hard to highlight all of those things at a time.
One of the things I would recommend is, one of the reasons I believe our interviews are more effective is because we do use the standard behavior-based questions. And so there's no reason the applicants can't have their own set of standardized questions. You could even take the ones we use and sort of use them on reverse. So on an interview, when you get an opportunity to ask a question, ask about, like, how does the department, what does the department consider, key to an inclusive environment? And so sort of put the questions back on the folks that you're interviewing with, and that may give you an opportunity to talk about what's important to you.
All right, good advice. And I think we're gonna do another poll question here. So let's pull that up. Give you a second to, we'll show you the answer to this in about 3 or 4 minutes after this next, tackle another question here. So an interesting question here from Ali Aminian. Hi, Ali, welcome, thanks for joining us. This, he said that it sounds like that the sections heads and chiefs generally agree with the recruitment committee. And I will say that that is definitely not true. Like, I think probably there was, in retrospect, there's more congruence as we're discussing it than there actually was in the time. In fact, I think that it's pretty clear that the committee has, I think, shapes the intentionality of the committee, shapes the interviewee, it shapes the process, it makes us come out of it with a different product, both probably indirectly through, as Dr. Alam mentioned, that we get different information and we trust the 15 or 20 people who put all the time into it. But there has also been what I would call productive conflict around candidates between the committee. And I saw some nodding when I said that from both chairs. So I think that is true. So I think that
I think there was always some back and forth, Justin, but I think I just typed an answer to that. We did not honestly invite anyone for on-site interview that was technically, academically, and training-wise not qualified for the job. You're wasting their time, you're wasting your time, and you're wasting the time of 15 or 20 people on the committee. So everyone who was invited for on-site interview were excellent candidates who were deserving of that position. And we were highly selective about who we invited. So then it came down to the difference between the top choice and the second choice and the third choice was mostly in terms of fit. And I think that's where actually having a committee really helps, because often fit is a code word for, like, finding somebody who looks like me. So I think that's where deciding whether the first candidate or the second or the third candidate is the right quote unquote fit, it keeps you honest. But we were not sort of settling for somebody who was second tier in any one of those choices.
I can add to that.
I was going to say that there's one good question here, Bilal, Joseph. I like your question here. I'm not quite sure I understand it. So if you're still on, about your system adjusting for internal candidates, if you can add a little more detail to that, we'll hit that. That sounds like an interesting question. Sorry, Erica, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with what Dr. Alam said. The one thing I would say is that we really tried during our, so we'd interview the candidate, and then once we, for a particular position, we'd have a discussion on all of the candidates together and start the ranking process. I think one thing that really helped us and kept us centered is that, we were really almost razor sharp focused on our values and our vision for our department. And that really centered on excellence in all of the core mission areas. And so we were very focused on clinical excellence, excellence in research, excellence in education, and then also we consider views and work in diversity, equity, and inclusion a core component of our excellence. And so how candidates were committed to that aspect of our vision and our values really, I think, helped us when it came down to, people were equivalent essentially based on the accomplishments on the CV. Because you can't really tease out someone's views on our values with respect to culture and equity and inclusion. And so I think that, because remember, we're trying to build a department of the future. And so we knew that this process and the people that we're hiring and bringing in, had to share that vision. I don't know if Chris and Leslie, if you have anything to add for that, but I think that was one of the, things that would set people apart, is their ability to engage and speak on and their potential to lead in that fourth core mission area.
Great. I had one
if you get a chance, I can answer Bilal's question, because we went through that thing with our acute care surgery.
But do you understand his question?
Yeah, I think if he's on, he can probably, but whether you make any adjustment for internal candidates. And I think for our acute care surgery, and it's tough because the committee knew 2 of those people. So we had 4 final candidates in the roster. We had 2 people from within the department competing for the division chief position, and we had 2 external candidates. And I think in that case,
maybe he just means, do we modify our practice?
Do we modify our practice? And we did not.
We do not.
We did not modify the practice. We made them go through the entire process. And you can argue whether that actually puts them at an advantage or disadvantage, because, people who are close to you, they're sort of, everyone has had weak moments where you've shouted to somebody, or people know sort of your post-call issue or whatnot, so they see your wrinkles and warts and everything, as opposed to somebody who's coming from outside. But you have to just be intentional about it. But I think in that specific case, having a committee really helped out, because one of the 2 internal candidates got the position and the other one did not. And I think having the weight of the committee and some deliberation around it by the 15 or 20 other people made the decision less. It was probably as hard for the person who didn't get it, but at least it made it more tolerable.
Okay, so I think one question that I wanted to hit on that was from our list that didn't come from the chat room, because I think we covered most of the things in the chat room, was this issue that comes up with, what do you do with hearsay? We noticed that one of the trickier things we had to navigate, I think, this year was when we were interviewing candidates and people would come forth because the recruitment committee was known now, the members were known, and people would come forth with unsolicited hearsay about essentially what we say, like whether they personal attributes or personal anecdotes, etc. And how do we handle that? And I think Leslie, why don't you tackle that, since you dealt with that this year?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, and I think what Hassan said is true. It's there are advantages to being internal candidates, and there are disadvantages, and certainly the opportunity for unsolicited opinions is much greater when you're an internal candidate. I think the approach we took is that we listened. I think it's, in today's day and age in society, it's foolish not to listen. So it's important to listen to the feedback that people may have for candidates. I think it requires a lot of somebody. They feel quite strongly about something to approach a committee member and talk to them about it. So we listen. We would discuss it usually, but then we were careful to consider how implicit bias may impact either, the report of the behavior or how we were interpreting the situation. And so, don't have any data or firm solutions, but that was kind of how we approach it. I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of the position, is how to fairly deal with hearsay, but also not to ignore it.
Yeah, and I think that was this is like I meet with my own boss like quarterly, and ask them. And this is one thing I actually brought up to discuss with our executive vice dean of academic affairs, Carol Bradford. Was like the only thing I had on my agenda item one meeting was just how would we handle this, and she gave us some good advice about that, because it's a tough. And I think her advice was to information is information, but you need to dissect it to make sure that you're not being unfair in your use with the information, right? I think that's
I think the challenge is that most of that hearsay and the information is not contemporary, it's old. So it comes in the form of like, this person 5 years ago when he or she was a resident, they shouted at me and they were a bully or said this or that. And I think it becomes very difficult. The facts are not verifiable. There are no witnesses, and the person who's being accused doesn't have there's no process in place for them to refute it or present a counter argument to it. So I think it is one of those tough things that you have old, outdated information expressed without any supporting evidence, and you have no way to verify it.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is that I think the hearsay argument, as Leslie went through, we struggled with, but I think we tried to deal with fairly. I think what was related but sometimes more challenging is when we had inequity of information. And so, for example, we had a candidate who trained as a resident at Michigan and then trained with colleagues of ours at another center for fellowship. We knew a lot. We had a lot of data coming into us, like unsolicited, about an individual like that. Someone who had no connections to Michigan. We didn't have that sort of data, and sometimes we would feed back to the section head or division chief. We recommend that you consider acquiring more information about this from the references at that institution. And one of the advantages of the behavior-based questions and getting to hear multiple people answer the same questions is occasionally they do raise little flags. The way they answered something about their approach to clinical complications, or the way they handle conflict, or and it just raises enough of a pause that again, we're not going to judge the person just on that one interaction in a heavily weighted interview, but we did give feedback to the division chief that you needed to investigate those sorts of concerns.
One piece of advice for either, if we have residents or even junior faculty on this webinar, every day you're creating your own narrative. So be aware of that, be proactive about it, create your own narrative rather than letting other people do it. So every time you're ready to snap at somebody, just don't. Be thoughtful, be careful, be polite, be professional, be caring. You are writing your narrative, and you're going to do it during your entire residency. And every time you get a leadership position, people are judging you. And if you want to aspire to be in a higher leadership position, all of that stuff will follow you.
So I think that that's probably worth putting out the counterpoint to this, right? Like there's the individual who might be unfairly getting characterized. There's also the history of leveraging personal networks to sweep bad behavior under the rug. And this type of recruitment committee brings that out onto the open air. So I think that, yes, that's possible, but at the same time, I think there's a history, let's be honest, right? Surgeons have a history of bad behavior and a history of egocentric actions and behaviors. And this type of committee can help bring some of that out into the light, because some of it is data. Some of it is written in evaluations and those sorts of things. And to the extent that that is data, and the old process would have just been like dismissive about that. Oh, quote, boys will be boys, and throw it out the window. Now we look at that, right? And those types of sweeping under the rug are no longer allowed or tolerated when you're bringing all the data out into the light. So I think that's the counterpoint, right? And we have to figure out how to have the benefits without the harms. I think that's the goal. But anyway, let's see the results of the polls, if we can pull those up. Does your department require implicit bias training? That's actually much higher than I would have thought. 51% say yes. It makes me think we might have a biased sample on this particular webinar if people are here to improve their recruitment packages. And what else do we have? Have you witnessed implicit bias in your department recruiting hiring process? Well, so once again, 61% saying yes, 39% say no. Once again, what is better than I would have thought? I think the true number there was probably 100%, if we're all being honest with ourselves. All right, my agenda is wrapping up now, and it says that Erica, you have the last word. So this was your invention, and you led the development of this. So I'll let you close out the webinar.
Well, I close it out by first just thanking all of my colleagues that have been on this journey from us from the beginning and still ongoing. Thank you for everyone that's joined us. I think that this is an exciting time, really, in American surgery, that we are just looking at ways to get better, and a component of getting better and a component of that excellence is taking a deep dive into diversity. And so changing systems and changing structures that have not been traditionally open and inclusive, I think, is a major step. And so I feel fortunate to have been able to participate in this for our department. And Dr. Kwashki mentioned earlier about, what's going on in our society. I think that this is timely, and really, as we're all throughout our organizations in medicine and beyond, are thinking about ways that we can address systemic racism, and I call it systemic violence because it is harmful. But this certainly is a way, I think, that our department is doing that, and that entails leveling the playing field for candidates that have been traditionally marginalized and underrepresented in academic medicine, and certainly in surgery. So with that, I thank you all for joining us.